Good morning, everyone. There was a very famous talk show host, Jack Parr, who once said with an introduction like that, say thank you and good night. Since it's only morning, I'll wait just a bit, but thank you very much. It is true, if I can give a compliment back, that if I were a teacher, which I am not, but if I were, and someone said to me, what is the best single book that explores the relationship between a person's faith and government service, that relationship that we're all always interested in, the relationship between God and government, I would recommend, without peer, Faith in the Halls of Power. In a very important way, Michael's book is a minor classic already, and it deserves to be read by everyone. By way of introduction, because this is what we do in America, we come to podiums and microphones, and usually the very nice person before the speaker arrives gives a wonderful professional distillation of that person that's specifically designed to give me credibility before I arrive at this podium, to let you all know that somehow I sort of know a bit about what I'm going to speak. And I want to begin this morning by saying to each and every one of you that perhaps in the history of Gordon College, there has never been a more inadequate person to come and address your chapel. If you ever wanted to see a poor, miserable sinner, a prideful hypocrite in Technicolor, I arrived. Here I am. And I want to delve, if I may, backward a little bit before I confirm the introduction that I just gave myself. Each and every young person, which includes every person in this chapel this morning, at some point begins to have a long conversation with him or herself. It's rooted in very large questions. It sounds a bit existential. Who am I? What is all this? What's the meaning and the purpose of it all? What am I supposed to do with my life? Who is God, and how am I to relate to him? And by the way, why does he really care about me? Also in Technicolor, standing before you this morning, is a nerd. I was and am a true nerd. I don't have a pocket protector with 400 pens. I went through that phase. I was telling Greg on the way this morning from Logan Airport that as a kid, I learned very early on that some of my best friends were books. C.S. Lewis has that wonderful phrase that we read books to know that we're not alone. And I can tell each and every one of you that there are certain days when I feel like that particular phrase affixed to my life in a very particular way. I know that I am surrounded in this room by some very gifted athletes. I was never one of those. In fact, I can confess to you all for the second time this morning that in the proverbial backyard pickup games, of which we had many in my growing up years in Fort Wayne, Indiana, I was not only the one who was always selected last, but I was the one who they forgot to select and then said, oh yes, he's here, please come and join our team. That was me. I learned very early on as a kid that all the things that I thought were so important, by and large, were not of interest to most of the people who were my age. As a young boy, I loved classical music and jazz. I loved to look at paintings. I was mesmerized early on by poetry. My grandmother, God rest her soul, never said no to the purchase of a new book. She was a really good grandparent. There was a moment at which there was a stack next to my bed. My grandmother said, "If it falls over, it'll kill you." So this is to confirm my nerdish bona fides. So this was my growing up. And one of the things that I learned early on, in a way that I can verbalize now, but that as young people you can't verbalize, all these things that make you, you, and that they would sound strange if they were said to either one other person. The things that made me, me, was this overlaying vortex of public policy, politics, and the press. I was born in 1964. You can count on your fingers and more than that. And I grew up in an era when most places, Boston, Fort Wayne, Indiana, New York, Philadelphia, Tuscaloosa, Alabama, almost every community in this country only had 3 television stations, a couple of radio stations that did news, maybe a newspaper or 2, and that was it. And I remember as a young boy watching the CBS Evening News with Walter Cronkite. Now, that really will confirm what a nerd I was. 22 minutes every night, 5 nights a week, and this would give you a bit of what was going on in the world. And Walter Cronkite, who was the most famous broadcast journalist of his era, would close his broadcast by saying, "And that's the way it is." And most Americans considered him to be the most trusted man in America, and we all thought that's the way it is. That was so exciting to me as a boy. I remember thinking, wow, there are really people who go to the White House every day to report on what the president's doing. And there are really correspondents in Rome. And gee, Florence seems so far away, and so does London. But that was very exciting to me as a boy growing up. And so I was bit very early with the journalism bug. And I learned by happenstance that the most famous journalist of the 20th century was born in my home state of Indiana, a man called Ernie Pyle, who actually was particularly famous for his dispatches during World War II. If there's anyone here going into journalism, I promise you, if you start reading Ernie Pyle, you'll never stop because he is mesmerizingly good. And in fact, he was killed with the troops at Iwo Jima. He was from Little Dana, Indiana. And a very good friend of mine said, you know, if you're thinking about journalism, you ought to think about the Indiana University School of Journalism, which is called Ernie Pyle, the Ernie Pyle School, named for the great man. And I did. I loved people, and I went to a very large state university and had a wonderful 4 years. And to all the people in this room who think that you've essentially figured out your professional trajectory, all those plans that you're scribbling out on your iPads and legal pads, if there are still such a thing, particularly in the Christian life, buckle in, because all the ways and all the places you think you're going, you're probably not. And all the things that you can never plan for, well, Providence has a road for you. By the way, unpredictability is one of the great blessings of the Christian life. And so is gratitude. And so is service to other people. So I was on my way, at least I thought. I began working in television when I was 12 years old. I did a program called News for Little People on the CBS affiliate in my hometown, and then a radio station called WOWO, which was a Westinghouse broadcasting station, a 50,000-watt station in my hometown. I did a program there every Sunday night. Went to Indiana University, did a radio program and some writing. And in my junior year, this will happen to all of you as well. May not be your junior year, your story may not be mine, but these kind of things will begin happening in your life because this is how God Almighty works. I received a call from a woman who was the best friend of the wife of our U.S. Senator in Indiana. And she said to me, I know you're interested in policy and the press. Would you be interested in being an intern in Washington, D.C. this summer in the United States Senate? And at first I was willing to say no because it wasn't journalism, but I decided, okay, I'll give it a shot. Now, my nerdism had graduated a bit into tennis. I'm passionate for tennis. I learned that you could be incredibly social because I love people, and you could play 3 sets in 1 hour. That's a fancy way of saying that even as an intern, before the sun sets in Washington, you can play about 9 sets. And you can meet people like you from all over the country who also grew up in hometowns where they also like things that most of the people around them didn't necessarily like either. And for the first time in my life, that summer in Washington, D.C., I could talk about the ballet and about opera and about jazz and about T.S. Eliot's poetry and why I like Stravinsky and not feel ashamed or embarrassed. And I found it incredibly liberating. So the next summer, I went back to Washington. That particular summer, I was an intern in the House of Representatives, and one of my great mentors at Indiana University had formerly been a bigwig at NBC News. He said to me, if you get that internship in the House of Representatives, I'll help you get an internship at NBC News on the weekends. I was blissful that summer, working in the House of Representatives during the week, taking the bus up Nebraska Avenue and going to NBC every Saturday and Sunday. I never went to meet the press more than I did that summer. And I learned what a fabulous, extraordinary journalist Tim Russert and Roger Mudd were. And it really began to shape my professional interests by coming closer and closer to my vocation. I graduated from Indiana University. I became an executive producer at the NBC affiliate in my hometown, writing and editing and producing the news. And after about a year, which is what you do in journalism, I thought, I'm ready to go to the next larger market, maybe Chicago or Cleveland or Detroit or something. And Providence intervened again. The U.S. Senator I had worked for, Dan Quayle, he went from being perhaps the most obscure U.S. Senator to the Vice President of the United States of America, plucked out of total obscurity. And the congressman I worked for, Dan Coates, who was even more obscure, became overnight the appointed U.S. Senator from Indiana. And Dan Coates remembered me, and he said, I've just been appointed to the U.S. Senate. Will you come to Washington and be my deputy press secretary? I need someone who knows a lot about radio and television. And I said yes. And when you're an appointed senator, you have to run 2 times in 4 years. So for those 4 years, I lived on airplanes and out of suitcases, helped Senator Coates raise $25 million, won 2 elections in 4 years, and I thought to myself, whew, short of scaling Mount McKinley, I'll never do anything like that again. But Providence intervened. I decided I've had enough of politics. And Senator Coates said, you've worked here for 4 years through 2 big campaigns. Why don't you just stay an extra year and become my press secretary? I got married, the biggest thing in my life. And I took his advice. I stayed a year. Maybe it's my 3rd confession of the morning, but in the Senate, 2 years became 4, and 4 became 6. And I ended up staying with him the entire time he was in the U.S. Senate. And when he retired from politics, I thought, I'm retiring from politics. And I thought, I'll take a job on K Street. I'm ready to step out of politics, and Providence intervened. And I worked for the Gary Bauer for President campaign in the year 2000. Now, Elizabeth Taylor said of her 9th husband, this won't take long. I thought that the Gary Bauer for President campaign would not take long. But it did. Gary was in for all 9 of the debates that year. He did a good job. He won, I think, by general acclaim, 5 of the 9 debates, which was pretty good for somebody who had never been elected to anything. And after the New Hampshire primary, He went out of the race, and I went out, and I thought, now I am really done with politics. And then Providence intervened one more time. I received a call from a woman called Karen Hughes, who was the communications director for then Governor George W. Bush. She said, and I quote, "We're not hiring many people from the Gary Bauer for President campaign, but we want you to come to Austin in 2 weeks. We know you're married. We know you have 2 children, ages 2 and 4. Leave them in Washington, D.C." And I said, "Karen, I accept the job, but we're a package deal." We rented our home in Alexandria, Virginia, to someone we had never met, and we moved into a walk-up 2-bedroom apartment. Downstairs, there were day laborers from Louisiana who thought a great night was smoking pot and drinking beer. We had a drought for the first 2 weeks. It was 118 degrees, and I thought, what in the world have I done? I had an extraordinary ride. And whether you love or hate George W. Bush, whether you love or hate Al Gore, and I hope it's none of the above, or all of the above, depending on your view, I was sent off to Florida for the famous Bush v. Gore, where I was for 32 days. A big night of sleep over those 32 days was 3 hours of sleep. I was in 9 different cities, and George W. Bush won the race. And I thought, now I am done with politics. I wasn't done with politics. Providence intervened. A man I had met a grand total of twice and had talked to a grand total of twice, short conversations, probably less than 10 minutes, was a man called Karl Rove. And he called me and he said, "Tim, George W. Bush is offering to make you a special assistant to the president and the deputy director of the White House Office of Public Liaison. And you'll be sworn in the East Room in 48 hours. My response to Karl is, "Can you speak the English language and tell me what this job entails?" And it was much as President Lindsay described. Now, I can tell you that in dog years, working at the White House for 8 years is about 5,000 years. Every day was different. I've written a memoir about it. I hope you and your 50 best friends will all read it. I'm told it's available in your bookstore, so run from here and read it. I know you're just back from spring break. It's tempting to say thank you, what a wonderful life it's been, but the thing to know is that you wouldn't know a single important thing about me if I stopped there. So let me go back to where I began. In Washington, I suppose it's true in Boston as well, when you have a bit of a whiff of success, the way that you deal with it is very different. There comes that moment. It's an invisible moment, by the way, because it's accumulative and it's incremental. But pride takes one of 3 avenues: power, sex, or money. The furniture changes, but human nature does not change. For me, my pride was always wanting to be the clever one, the one who said it and wrote it better than anybody else. And I had been asked about 20-some years ago to write a column for my hometown newspaper. The editor said, write about everything except for politics: tennis, philosophy, theology, poetry, jazz, Rembrandt, Picasso. And I did. Except I never felt that I was really saying it better than anybody else. So I began, in the midst of my White House career, to plagiarize. Now, let me just tell you all that the one thing that prideful people have in common is deceit. Because prideful people don't feel they're really quite up to snuff the way that God made them. So they have to compensate. That's the seed of pride in power. It's the seed of pride in money, and it's the seed of pride in sex. And I'm sure many other avenues. I knew exactly what I was doing. It was not pressure. It was not stress. It was not busyness. Yes, my life was pressure-filled. Yes, my life was stress-filled. Yes, my life was busy. The inbox for me in those years and now was never empty. Those are not excuses. There was no one to blame but me. There was no extenuating circumstance except for one thing, my prideful arrogance. And it grew and grew and grew. I had a friend who was very famous, no longer with us, Bill Buckley, William F. Buckley. He went to see Richard Nixon one day, and Bill recounted to me, he said, you know, it's an amazing thing, he said, to be in the Oval Office and to see the President of the United States of America taking notes while you're speaking. To a person of humility, that is a blessing. To a person of pride, it's an elixir. Why was the boy from Fort Wayne, Indiana, the one who was on this remarkable professional upward trajectory, married to the love of his life, 2 boys, you know, on those artificial silos, all the boxes were being checked? Why was the way that God created me just not enough? That's the seed and the evil and the sin of pride. By the way, other than your wonderful president and dean of chapel, and one other person who was nice enough to introduce herself to me, I'm quite certain until about half an hour none of us had ever met. But I hope today, in fact, it's been my morning prayer on the plane here from Washington, that perhaps there was at least one person in this chapel, I'm eager not to know who you are, who is struggling with pride. If you're that person, you're an answer to my prayer, and I hope that I'm speaking to you because I hope and pray with more passion and fervor that you know that I'm speaking to you today, that you can learn from my grievous mistake. So I came back to the White House one morning after breakfast, and I got an email. And the email was from a reporter, and it was a very short question. Did I plagiarize that column? Now, I won't demonstrate for you, but you can take my word for it, that my knees buckled and I fell down next to my desk at the White House and I prayed the following prayer. Oh God, oh God. It was true. And I sent an email back to the reporter and I said, it is true, I am guilty as charged. Now, in Washington, when you embarrass the president, or the vice president, or the governor, or the senator, or the congressman, or the whomever, there's a kind of divorce that takes place. And it happens very rapidly. You become, in the split second, Mr. High and Mighty to persona non grata. As you snap your fingers, you're going from your opinion counts to whose opinion? I managed that day to resign my position, a position that I would have done for free if I were a billionaire. That's how much I loved what I did. I resigned in a letter to the president, and I sort of slunk out of the White House. I got into my car. I went across the Memorial Bridge back to Virginia. I went home and I collapsed. Not however, before talking to my wife, the love of my life, who said to me the words that every prideful person will eventually hear once they are uncovered. My wife said to me the following: "I thought I knew you." She could say that, or she could pierce me. And I would assume that the piercing would have caused less pain. I inflicted upon my wife and children, my parents and family, all my mentors who had invested so much of themselves in me, the President of the United States of America, who gave me the professional ride of a lifetime. This is what prideful people do. They inflict pain on other people. Now, I don't know if anybody in this room, in this chapel, has been in a crisis. I learned that there are two kinds of crises. One kind of crisis is, God forbid, when the tornado hits your house. That's the kind you can't, that you're not responsible for. The other kind of crisis is the one that you cause by your choices, and then you bring other people along for your trip to the bottom. My entire professional and personal world was collapsing like a house of cards. None more so than to the 20 years of interns who had invested, people just like you, by the way, young, bright, smart people who had come to the White House, come to the Senate to work with me, and had been kind enough to ask me how I could be of help. So I went back in on Monday. I began cleaning out my desk and taking the pictures off the walls, and the telephone rang. And the President's chief of staff said that the boss wanted to see me. Now, at the White House, when it's good news, the President wants to see you. And when it's bad news, the boss wants to see you. And I went to the Oval Office for my much-deserved woodshed moment. You have to remember, I made the ticker tapes on Fox, CNBC, CNN. You know, Bush's Christian guy, what a hypocrite. In the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, the Associated Press. My infamy was everywhere. So I went to the Oval Office, and I expected a litany of senior people to read me the proverbial riot act, which I deserved. I went into the Oval Office, and it was just the President and me, and I closed the door, and I knew that because it was just him and me, this was going to be really bad. And I turned to the President to apologize as I recount in my book. I looked him in the eyes, and I said, "Sir," and he looked at me, and he said, "Tim, you're forgiven." Now, there was this odd silence like this. It just kind of went on and on. I remember hearing the air conditioning ducts. It was very uncomfortable. And I tried a second time to apologize. I said, "Mr. President," and he looked at me in the eyes, and he said, "Tim, I've known grace and mercy, and I'm extending grace and mercy to you. You're forgiven." I said, "Mr. President, I owe you a categorical apology. I am so sorry." I said, "You should have taken me by the lapels and tossed me onto Pennsylvania Avenue for what I've done." He said, "You're forgiven. Grace and mercy are real. I'm extending them to you. Now we can talk about all of this, or we can talk about the 8 last years." And I went to sit down on one of the couches at the Oval Office, and he said, no, sit over here, which was the chair of honor, where either the vice president or a head of state sits below the famous portrait of George Washington in front of the fireplace. We prayed together. We spoke of the last 8 years. He shared with me the incredible grace and mercy and forgiveness and love and compassion of Jesus Christ that had been a central part of his life. And I turned and looked at the Oval Office, knowing that that was the last time I would be there, and prepared to depart. And he said, "Oh, and by the way, I want you to bring your wife and children here so that I can tell them what a great husband and father you've been." May I just tell you all, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative, this is not how the leader of the free world spends his time. And he affirmed me in front of my wife and boys, and I thought, that's the last time we'll see the president. They invited us to the White House many times. We've become very good friends. And it's been the most dramatic and remarkable sense of grace in my life. I remember reading just 2 weeks ago this passage of the lepers, and I realized, not metaphorically, not theoretically, but really, that I was the leper, and that I was being extended the grace of Jesus Christ. I want to assure you all that this idea of faith and public life, the idea of, in the American experience, how does public policy and revelation, how do they go together, left and right? But I'm here to tell you in a first-person narrative that if the center of it is not Jesus Christ, and the center of it is not grace and mercy that is real, that all the rest of it is for show. So I did not come in the midst of an hour in our country when there is great division between left and right to talk about politics or about public policy or the press. But I came to leave you with one very basic idea. T.S. Eliot, who I mentioned earlier, said that humility is endless. And I believe humility is endless. And I believe that the seed of greatness is true humility. And I believe that in the Christian life, that gratitude and service and humility are of one piece. And I hope I've said something worth hearing. And I know that as you step off into this last part of your academic year, that big things are ahead. But my great prayer for each and every person here is a life of service and gratitude, but all underscored by humility. Thank you all. God bless you, and God bless the great Gordon College.